have irrefutable evidence that this Premier is putting his own political ideology ahead of the health and safety of Albertans. Documented in leaked audio tapes released today by the CBC, there is evidence that the Premier, the Health Minister and other members of Cabinet are ignoring or outright rejecting public health advice, pressuring and controlling civil servants, and refusing to put the health of Albertans first, allowing uncontrolled spread of COVID-19. So to the Premier, how can anyone trust you when these tapes prove that their health appears to be the last thing you think about when you make a decision?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the only ideological agenda being driven here is the NDP's desire to put hundreds of thousands of people out of work, to close perhaps permanently tens of thousands of business, and to impose lasting damage on Alberta's livelihoods. Our government instead is taking on board the expert public health advice that we receive. Of course, we have to balance that with the broader social, economic, mental, emotional, and physical health concerns, as our Chief Medical Officer has pointed out, because ultimately, Mr. Speaker, it's the elected representatives of the people of Alberta who must make these very difficult decisions.
Leader of the Opposition.
Well, you know, Mr. Speaker, the Premier tells Albertans he's taking the advice of the CMO, but we now know that this government is lying. Trust has been irrevocably broken. Today, we have proposed that this government establish an independent panel of medical experts who would make public health recommendations. Their recommendations would be published publicly, so Albertans could see what was advised and what the Premier accepted or rejected. Premier, will you do the right thing, rebuild trust with Albertans, and establish this panel today?
The Honourable the Premier.
Speaker, let me quote our remarkably capable Chief Medical Officer in her testimony at the Public Accounts Committee, in which she said, "It's really critical that elected officials be the ones to make final decisions because there are public health considerations, but there are other considerations, such as the wishes and values of the population who elected leaders to make decisions on their behalf." Mr. Speaker, Alberta is a democracy, and under this government it's going to stay that way.
Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, for months this Premier hid behind Dr. Hinshaw's skirts, claiming that he was following her advice he refused to share with Albertans. Now we know why. The tapes describe a cabinet that would only approve, quote, the minimal acceptable recommendations from public health, end quote. Senior officials, including the CMO, describe cabinet meetings as, quote, uphill battles, and, quote, a bloody and excruciating campaign. Mr. Speaker, more than 50,000 Albertans have been sick, 13,000 still are. Why is this government lying to Albertans?
The Speaker made some significant comments about saying the government is lying or the opposition is lying yesterday. What is unparliamentary in this place is for them to say an individual is lying. I heard the Leader of the Official Opposition say the government is. Well, I did provide a caution yesterday at some length. Perhaps the Leader of the Opposition missed it because it certainly doesn't increase decorum in the Assembly to use language like that. It's not a point of order at this time, but like I provided the caution yesterday, perhaps you might consider using different words. The Honourable the Premier.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, according to today's revelation, my attitude was, quotes, that I wasn't going to close down anything that affected the economy unless the Premier was provided with evidence about how it curtailed the spread. Mr. Speaker, I plead guilty. I have sought evidence and data to inform our challenging public health decisions and ensure that they are taken in a balanced way that maximizes the positive public health impact while minimizing the negative social and economic impact.
The Honourable the Leader of the Official Opposition for a second set of questions.
He hasn't shown that evidence, Mr. Speaker, and what we know is that, again, your negligence is far more dangerous to the economy than public health measures. Now, one troubling revelation is the suggestion that political officials interfered in quasi-judicial decision-making. The tape suggests attempts by the Health Minister's office to exert total control over enforcement. The day the Premier announced his economic relaunch, the Health Minister's office made it clear that they expected AHS to seek permission before any action was taken to enforce health orders. Does the Premier not understand that his politics have no place in enforcing laws made to protect
the Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, every word just uttered by the NDP leader is false. The Minister of Health's office simply asked to be advised if enforcement action was being taken. That is entirely normal because the minister has to answer to the legislature about questions that arise. Mr. Speaker, let me quote Dr. Hinshaw further. She said, "It's the role of Cabinet to make the extremely difficult decisions about how to take the information provided and include it along with all the other considerations that must be brought to bear on these very impactful decisions." I know for the NDP this is not difficult because they just want to shut down everything and destroy countless livelihoods. But for this government, it is a challenging decision to balance all of these considerations.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Allowing this virus to spread uncontrolled is what is going to destroy Albertans' livelihoods, and the majority of Albertans understand that. It's this Premier who doesn't. Now, also, the tape itself said, in contrast to what the Premier just said, don't turn a blind eye, but don't issue any orders. Quote, come to us, and if push comes to shove, I think it will be up to the ministry to figure out if we are going to do something. That's with respect to enforcing orders. Premier, this is a clear abuse of authority. Why are you playing political games with the enforcement of laws designed to keep Albertans healthy and safe?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, that is simply and completely untrue. The Minister's office asked per normal to be advised if there was enforcement activity occurring, which would be normal practice with any high-profile enforcement activity. Mr. Speaker, you know, the shocking lead of the CBC story to which the NDP refers says that I asked, I plead guilty, Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry, I asked to get pros and cons on serologic testing. Yes, Mr. Speaker, I actually asked for additional information to inform important cabinet decisions.
The Leader of the Opposition.
The CMO is on tape. Quote, they don't want us to enforce anything. They just want us to educate. No enforcement. In Alberta, we have 62 enforcement actions. Meanwhile, BC has 700 actions and 51,000 inspections. To the Premier, why would you pass public health orders and then direct that they not be enforced? Don't you realize that in doing this, you are risking the lives and livelihoods of Albertans throughout the province?
The Honourable Premier.
No such decision has been, no such directive has been made, Mr. Speaker, and that is categorically false. As I've quoted our Chief Medical Officer at the very beginning of COVID, when quite frankly, we were all at a loss about how best to respond. I remember her advice every day that we're not going to enforce our way out of this. And through the first 8 months of this pandemic, Albertans have done very well without an excess of lockdown-style policies that the NDP advocates. We now have to impose more stringent measures that are enforceable, such as the prohibition on indoor social activities and extraordinary and unprecedented use of state power.
The Honourable, the Leader of the Opposition.
The actual audio tapes of the CMO show that what the Premier just said is not true. Now, yesterday, when I asked the Premier why our case numbers are so much higher than BC's, you know, where they have greater restrictions and a province-wide mask mandate, he tried to claim it was because we lead the country in testing. But again, that's also not true. On a per capita basis, Alberta is actually in the middle of the pack. Ontario and Manitoba are testing far more than for their population. Will the Premier stand up today, recognize that he is the reason that our case numbers keep going up, and apologize for saying that things that aren't true here in the House?
The Honourable, the Premier.
Once again, the NDP pathetically trying to politicize a pandemic, as they have done irresponsibly from day one. Secondly, the Chief Medical Officer is not responsible enforcement, Mr. Speaker. Law enforcement officers are. Police and designated peace officers are. Mr. Speaker, and AHS inspectors are. Thirdly, Mr. Speaker, with respect to testing, it is a matter of public record that Alberta has led per capita testing across Canada for most of the last 9 months, not on every day, but part of the dispute in that CBC article is our government seeking higher levels of asymptomatic testing and the Health Department not agreeing at that point.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The Premier needs to be better briefed, Mr. Speaker. The fact is that we are not leading the country. That's just true. Now, testing is what detects cases, not what drives them. Quote, we've had the highest per capita level of testing. Their case count is lower because their testing has been 1/3 of our level. Quote, cases are up because we have the best testing in the world and we have the most testing, end quote. Now, one of those quotes is the Premier and one of them is from Donald Trump. To the Premier, do you think it's a problem that Albertans can't tell which is which?
The Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, let me explain a very simple concept to the Leader of the Opposition. When you test a larger number of individuals, you identify more cases, and amongst those cases, some of them have infections. Mr. Speaker, the reality is that for most of the last 9 months, as a matter of record, Alberta had the highest per capita testing levels in Canada, amongst the highest in the world, substantially higher through most of the past 9 months than our neighbours in BC. One of the reasons for that is Dr. Henry there refused to do asymptomatic testing. We wanted, as a cabinet, to do asymptomatic testing to get a broader picture of where we were, one of the reasons that we have had higher testing levels.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Middle of the pack. The facts are clear. Now, this Premier has called COVID-19 influenza. He said it only affects the elderly. He's backed hydrochloroquine as a cure. He hid from Albertans for days on end. He rejects scientific advice and evidence. Now, cases are exploding, the health system is overwhelmed, and Albertans have lost all trust in his leadership. So, Mr. Speaker, does the Premier realize that if he keeps following Donald Trump's pandemic response, he too will be overseeing hundreds of thousands of needless infections, serious illness, and enduring economic strife?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, to highlight just how absurd and self-contradictory the NDP's position is, consider this. The member is criticizing this government for not currently having higher testing levels. The primary reason we do not currently have higher testing levels, Mr. Speaker, is because we have adopted the Chief Medical Officer's advice largely to suspend asymptomatic testing in order to have faster turnaround times for priority population cohorts and people who are symptomatic. She's criticizing us for not following the CMO's advice when we are actually following the CMO's advice.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton City Centre.